Got a fresh pile of parts here. These are my Watts link ends and the chassis side third link mount. So I gotta work on these. These are meant to be dimple dyed to try to add some strength to them because they're gonna be so far away from where the frame is up here. The short ones don't have anything because they're a lot closer to where the frame is at. But we're going from the ones that I mocked up to something a little bit thinner and lighter because I'm pretty sure I can put the strength back in it. And then I also was able to, by going this route and getting laser cut, make sure that from the base of the frame down to my hole location was even, both from the edge of the frame on each side as well as the height. Just comes out a lot more accurate than the stuff I was making by hand. So we'll dimple dye these, and then need to probably fit everything to the chassis a little bit. This is meant to be a threaded plate, so I don't have to try to get a wrench in there and a nut on the back side, and then I can move it up and down as needed. These plates will need to be bolted together with the arm and the spacers to be able to set the height, and then probably I'll tack them a little bit, and then it'll just take some fitment to see how well they fit the chassis. So. It actually fits to the chassis pretty good. It might be at a slight angle, but I want to lock the sides together before I do any grinding to fit up here to try to level it out in the chassis. So I've got spacers in here to hold the spread, and then I made this little plate just as a kind of backing plate to help stiffen it up. And it'll just sit right on there, and I can put an easy weld across it. Got this little relief cut here just for any possible extreme angle down at the bottom. The way everything's planned out, it should be level or near level, and it really shouldn't change a whole lot with suspension movement, because from level with the longer arm on there, I mean really several inches at the center of the pumpkin's only going to be a few degrees out here. So I wanted to make sure there was plenty of room. I just need to take this up and then take a look at fitting it to the frame. I decided to dress the welds down just to make it look like a single part. I'm really happy with the way that came out. It just kind of dresses it up and makes it look a little nicer. Even though it's under the car and nobody will ever see it. Surprisingly enough, all my parts seem to fit the chassis quite well for just being measured from a piece of cardboard that I cut out. Unsurprisingly, it's the frame that's going to be the problem, where there's factory booger welds, and that's just some small minor stuff that's not letting them sit in place quite as good as they could, so that will be a minor fix. This is how it's looking like it's gonna fit up. I got this edge cut so that'll line up with the edge of this pocket right here. Should give it some nice strength, and then the other side, as you can see, should wrap around and go up right alongside it. But we've got some weld that sticks out just a little bit here on the bottom, so I'll be able to just hit that with the grinder, take it off. This side's not so bad, the other side's worse. But for how it sits on there, I mean, and there's almost no gap. As you can see on this side, there's just a little bit of gap, but really not much. The biggest downfall comes into how square this thing is to the chassis this way. And to get that set, I'll end up using a laser and a level just to make sure that it fits up. Worst case scenario for fitting anything up, this plate is my basically home plate. So I'm not going to be touching anything on this edge or this one unless I have to take a little bit off of this edge to make a better fit over on this side. But for the most part, I think we're going to be really close. I can just grind those welds that I showed on the frame down a little bit, and this should fit up tight enough to make a really nice weld to the frame. As you can see with the upper, it pretty much falls right into place. It's tight up there on the top, the back edge, all the way down. It goes around the bump here on the frame on the factory side. Really the only thing holding me up at the moment is this nut right here contacting, and the nut is as thick as my threaded plate will be, so I can just trim this edge a little bit because it's still got to move a little bit towards the center of the car. But I mean, we're talking an 1/8 inch at the most, and it just, man, it fits so nice up in there. Now what I'm doing here is I'm grinding to prep the lower brackets for welding on those shock mounts that I had. I ended up cutting them like I talked about in the previous video, and then I'm just using the single bolt on each side to hold them in place and line them up with some scribe marks that I made.
So the state of the podcast episode that I
also added the brake line tabs to each side. I just kind of lined them up where they had been on the previous rear end and getting them welded in place so that it's ready to put brake lines on.
But I have to go give him his.
The shock tabs shouldn't be going anywhere. I got at least an inch and a half of weld on both sides of the block and should be good. And for the upper 4-link brackets, I cut them down to get the bushing centered correctly. Here is actually interfering with the bracket on this side. I'll have to grind that down flush to the frame rail, which probably means all the weld's going to be gone, so I'll have to put a new weld on there. So still going to need to get all the paint cleared off for that. And I'm just going to be prepping the area under here so that I can get the brackets tacked on and then figure out what I got to build for on the rear end housing for holding the Wattslink propeller.
Kind of do still sometimes. Like, I don't want to not be a part of it. Like, maybe Abe wants to be a part of it. And I was like, yeah, Abe probably does. I literally I see photo when Abe was like, hey, about like whatever's going on, or I'm sure that for exactly 3 shows. No, I get some way more. There was like 20 or 30 shows or something where like reading 7 articles a week on travel. It was something every day. Yeah, what was crazy is like it's bringing the track home. Yeah. Or the only thing you need on your track there to do your first track day is windshield. Yeah.
Sometimes you try to level it in there and it gets all screwed up, so I had to break out the laser. This is a pretty new tool for me that I bought specifically for trying to align these Wattslink bars side to side. So right there, it's down at the base of the nut, and then it's also lining up right with the edge right here and onto that nut. And that's at least trying to get help me get it as straight in the car as I can. So I've got all the Watts Link brackets mocked up. I got the frame ones and just some plates coming off and holding the pumpkin side where it needs to be. I'm just trying to keep everything in line. I actually used the laser to check everything across the car. I'm spaced out quite a bit from the rear end, and the reason for that is because not so much this side, but the other side, being as the bolts up here, gets real tight to the spring on the coilover. I did have room. I could have stood the coilovers up, but I wanted to make them work with the factory upper locations, just because if I end up selling this kit, it'll have to clear that because that's what most people will be running a setup with. However, there is enough room that if I wanted to change the location top and bottom, I could mount the coilover more inboard and completely vertical, which would save a couple of inches here, which could actually shorten up the structure down there at the pumpkin. There's also a room where I could possibly put the coilover in front of the rear axle and have it all positioned right here and utilize a portion of the factory spring pocket, which I think it'd be the most ideal setup, because then I could really move a bunch of this in, especially on the Watt. Like, I can basically move it in far enough there that's barely off of the pumpkin and save a lot of distance there. But going with the setup here, it's able to utilize a lot of mounting points that I don't have to then re-engineer at this time. Alright, now let's back out of the car. As you can see, that Watts Link bracket is not square to the rear end, and that's because of where the factory 4-link had it angled at. Just ended up with a bunch of downward angle to the front, about 7 degrees compared to being completely level, which is pretty much not where we want to be, because the transmission and engine itself are downward almost 5 degrees to the rear, so those are in effect opposite of each other. So when I go to the 3-link, we're going to be making the upper arm longer to try to level it out. So I want to correct that on the Watts Link versus being out of alignment after it's corrected. And even with the 4-link setup, I can lengthen the upper arms to correct that. I just took the level gauge, and you can see the scribe lines I got on there. That's basically the wedge I'll cut out to make it level with the front face where the third member goes in. able to tap the nut plate that I'm putting on the third link bracket for the frame side. The reason I'm doing this is it's not exactly the easiest place to get a nut into and then have a wrench up in there as well. So I'm doing this nut plate so all the holes will be threaded ahead of time. It'll just be a matter of pulling the bolt out, running it into the next hole when making a setup change. And that should keep it pretty easy. As you can see, I was taking my time trying to make sure that the tap was going in square. These were laser cut holes for this plate and they didn't come out super perfect, and I assume the laser also kind of hardened the edge a little bit. I was able to get them in there and tapping pretty much straight, but after I had the first two in, I was able to use both plates and look at getting it lined up a little easier with both plates spaced apart from each other. After attempting to do this and it kind of not going super well at first, I realized that, oh wait, the hole and the tap might be the same size as a piece of tube I have laying around. And sure enough, it happened to fit almost perfectly. Like it slip fit into the hole and it was just a slip fit onto the tap. And that worked out great, as you can see. And that kept everything lined up nice and straight. It made it a lot easier to run the tap through. And then just to be sure, I went back and rechased both end thread holes to just make sure that everything was good there. Then I needed to weld that nut plate to the plate that it goes on. I didn't need to put as much weld as I did on, because all it is there was to encapsulate the two plates, or what's going to be welded to the chassis. The nut plate just needed to be more or less tacked on, but I just put a weld bead down the whole side and on both sides just so that I could give a little extra strength to that plate itself, and I know that it's not going to go anywhere. Alright, I am fully installed with the 3-link setup and the Watts link. It's got good movement up and down. I got kind of limited because I'd be hitting the bump stops on both sides because I'm trying to mimic ride height right here. But if I lower it down a little bit, stay off the bump stops, I got free movement up and down. Everything is able to rotate freely, nothing's bound up. I am still about 5 degrees off on my pinion angle compared to where the transmission's at. The drive line is aimed down to the back a bit. I'm trying to decide whether or not it's worth cutting up the floor to try to raise the tail shaft up and take some of that angle out. If I want to try to adjust more with the rear end, I will end up having to modify that cross brace I have up on the top. And that's not surprising at this point after seeing how far off all the 4-link arms were with the pinion angle, and everything was just kind of a mess there. So trying to fix all that now. If I gotta cut that cross brace out or modify it or whatever I gotta do there, I'll figure that out. But other than that, I mean, it's nice, free movement. None of the brackets or anything interferes with 4-link versus 3-link. So that's good news for being able to try to do a test day with back-to-back results kind of a thing. So I'm looking forward to doing that later this spring. And I don't know, I'm pretty happy that everything's starting to work out here, other than, you know, we're running into the last couple of small issues, like rolling the pinion angle back some more to try and match up the transmission. I'm already pretty tight down here with the coilovers. I could space them out, except that on the other side, the upper gets really tight. This is about where my ride height adjustment is at, so I have clearance here, but if I have to notch that out some, I can do that later on. I really, for the most part, just need to keep this forward so I don't run into problems on the other side. The Watts link brackets are now ever so slightly out of alignment. Definitely well within the range of the misalignment. But again, if I roll the pinion angle back some more towards the rear of the car, that will actually line up even better. So it's probably going to be my solution going forward. The downside for switching back and forth is that I know with these extended out, they were originally shortened up almost as far as they could go. But even with them backed off this far, I know it's not going to be enough to fix the pinion angle the way it should be. So if I want to do some back-to-back testing and try to eliminate the pinion angle as being a factor, I'll have to make some custom upper arms in order to do that. But all in all, I am very happy with how this is coming out so far. Certainly is going to pan out really nicely, I think. We just got to finish sorting out a few little small details and go from there.